Judge Prescott assumed he could quiet Pam Bondi with a penalty, never anticipating she'd unravel his whole reasoning right there in front of everyone. The courthouse in Tampa, Florida, had witnessed its share of courtroom clashes, but on that specific morning, nobody could have foreseen the tempest that was about to erupt. Pam Bondi, sharp as always, strode through the hefty wooden doors, briefcase in one hand, the other straightening her blazer's lapel. She had arrived for what ought to have been a standard hearing, one she could handle effortlessly. As she approached the defendant's table, she sensed the judge's gaze on her before he uttered a word. Judge Alan Prescott, a figure renowned for his stern, no-frills attitude, was fixated not on her eyes, but on something just beneath her collarbone, a modest gold cross. The courtroom atmosphere thickened, a hushed stillness settling in. Then, with a voice as cutting as a gavel's bang, Prescott cleared his throat and leaned closer. "Miss Bondi, I must inform you," he said, "that religious emblems have no place in my court." Pam barely reacted. "Your Honor, you're wearing a cross," she replied. "That breaches the impartiality of this space. You'll need to take it off or pay a fine." A ripple of whispers spread among the sparse onlookers present. The bailiff shifted awkwardly. The clerk flicked her eyes from the judge to Pam. This wasn't the first instance a judge had attempted to impose control over his domain in an odd manner, but it was unprecedented for anyone to consider penalizing a lawyer over a necklace. Pam stood still. "My apologies, Your Honor, but my cross is no different from a wedding band or a locket holding a loved one's picture." Judge Prescott's expression stayed impassive. "That's not my view," he sighed, as if already weary of the exchange. "Either remove it, or I'll impose a fine for ignoring courtroom impartiality." For the first time in her professional life, Pam Bondi faced a fine. Not for misbehavior, not for a technical breach, but for sporting a piece of jewelry. The fine itself wasn't the core issue. It was what it symbolized. She didn't remove the cross. Instead, she rested her hands on her briefcase, her demeanor calm. She wasn't letting this slide. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to formally address this matter," Pam said. Judge Prescott arched an eyebrow. "Address it, yes," she continued. "I'll be lodging an objection and wish to present my case on the record." The judge smirked, eyeing the clock on the wall. "Ms. Bondi, I'm certain you realize this hearing concerns a business conflict, not your personal disputes." Pam didn't waver. "I'm also certain that the First Amendment doesn't pause for individual biases." That caught his focus. He eased back in his seat, eyes narrowing faintly. The court reporter's fingers lingered above her keys, the room now teetering on edge. Not due to a contractual legal fight, but because a veteran lawyer had just confronted a judge's dominance head-on. Pam knew she was treading a fine line, but retreat wasn't in her nature. "You're penalizing me for wearing a cross. Let's dissect that legally, shall we?" The judge exhaled, massaging his temples, but before he could counter, Pam was already delving into her briefcase. She wasn't merely going to debate, she was set to dismantle his entire foundation. Yet, Judge Prescott hadn't grasped just how deep a pit he'd begun carving for himself. Pam drew a lone sheet of paper from her briefcase, setting it gently on the table before her. She didn't hasten. Every action was calculated, every moment of quiet heightening the strain in the air. Judge Prescott sighed. "Ms. Bondi, I don't have patience for theatrics." Pam didn't flinch. "Nor do I, Your Honor. But what I do possess is a solid grasp of constitutional law." The judge leaned in, hands clasped, as if steeling himself for what lay ahead. "You're fining me for wearing a cross, asserting it undermines courtroom neutrality. But tell me, Your Honor, what legal basis supports that claim?" The room fell silent. The court reporter's fingers paused over her keyboard. The bailiff scarcely moved in his spot. Judge Prescott released a measured breath. "This courtroom functions under my jurisdiction, Ms. Bondi." Pam nodded. "It does, but that jurisdiction isn't above the Constitution." She tapped the paper before her. "And under the First Amendment, Personal religious expression is safeguarded, particularly when it doesn't interfere with proceedings. The judge scoffed. You're a lawyer, not a legal scholar. Pam smiled, but it lacked friendliness. Then let's discuss case law, shall we? She lifted the paper. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. A pivotal ruling affirming that people don't forfeit their constitutional protections when entering a public institution, be it a school or a courtroom. Judge Prescott's jaw stiffened subtly. He knew that case. Every legal mind did. Pam pressed on. West Virginia State Board of Education v. Barnett, 1943. The Supreme Court determined that forcing individuals to discard or conceal symbols of personal conviction violates their First Amendment rights. She placed the paper down. Now, Your Honor, shall I continue, or would you rather rethink that fine? The judge's fingers drummed against his chair's armrest. He was boxed in, and he knew it, but his ego wouldn't yield. Not yet. This isn't a theological debate, Miss Bondi. Pam tilted her head. Then why did you turn it into one? A few hushed gasps echoed in the courtroom. Judge Prescott's expression darkened. Enough, he snapped, but his grip was weakening. Pam leaned closer, voice unwavering. With all due respect, Your Honor, I'll stop when I hear a legal rationale for this fine, because so far, I haven't. A prolonged silence followed. The judge finally glanced at the clerk. Note the fine as pending review. Pam smirked. I'll consider that a provisional win. But she wasn't finished yet. The true clash was only just igniting. Judge Prescott's face stayed stoic, but the way he shifted in his seat betrayed him. He'd anticipated meek compliance, not a full-fledged constitutional standoff. The courtroom air was no longer merely tense, it crackled with energy. Pam felt it. Every pair of eyes was locked on her, watching, waiting. She'd drawn a boundary, and now the judge faced a dilemma. Cling to his flimsy reasoning and risk disgrace, or retreat without losing command. But Prescott wasn't one to surrender readily. Miss Bondi, he started, his tone controlled. Courtroom regulations exist for a purpose. If I permit one type of personal expression, I invite them all. Pam's lips tightened. You mean, like the wedding rings on half the lawyers here, or the lapel pins you allow on public officials? Prescott's jaw clenched. Pam didn't relent. Or how about when you let a defense attorney wear a pink ribbon for breast cancer awareness during a trial? You didn't object then. A few soft murmurs arose among the spectators. Prescott shot a stern look their way. But the harm was done. Pam had just highlighted his inconsistent standards. Pam leaned back, folding her arms. So explain, Your Honor, why this rule targets only my cross. Prescott's fingers gripped the edge of his desk. He was ensnared, and every person in that room could see it. He'd enforced an unspoken policy rooted in personal prejudice, and now it was collapsing beneath him. For the first time since the hearing began, he lacked a retort. Pam didn't need to revel in it. She simply let the silence linger, long enough for everyone to grasp the situation's truth. Then she struck the decisive blow. If you uphold this fine, Your Honor, I'll file an appeal before the ruling's ink dries. And when I do, I assure you, this case will grab headlines. A sitting judge fining a woman for wearing a cross in court. I'm confident the appellate courts would relish weighing in on that precedent. Prescott's nostrils flared. His pride and ego waged a battle against stark reality. Pam didn't look away. She let him stew in it. The longer he hesitated, the more evident his error became. At last, after what seemed an eternity, he exhaled sharply. The fine is withdrawn, he muttered. Pam smiled. Much obliged, Your Honor. But this wasn't just about a fine anymore. She'd delivered a resounding message, one Prescott wouldn't soon forget. Yet the repercussions were only beginning. The judge's words, the fine is withdrawn, should have concluded it, but the courtroom had transformed beyond a legal arena. It was now a spectacle, and everyone there had just seen something unforgettable. The court reporter barely glanced up from her typing, but even she knew this record would spread beyond these walls. The clerk, who'd seemed uneasy when the fine was issued, now cast a quick look at Pam, almost as if admiring her. Judge Prescott adjusted his papers, shuffling them as if he could physically wipe away the moment. But Pam knew better. This wasn't something he could dismiss. The silence roared. Pam calmly smoothed her blazer, the small gold cross still resting exactly where it had been all along. She prevailed, but now she had to ensure this wasn't merely a personal triumph. It needed to carry broader weight. She turned to her client, a middle-aged entrepreneur who'd been the actual focus of the hearing. The man offered her a subtle nod of admiration. His trust in her had only deepened. Pam realized this wasn't solely about her anymore. Outside the courthouse, the response was swift. A journalist, covering a separate case in the same building, caught wind of what had transpired. Within an hour, a local news site published the headline, "Florida Judge Tries to Fine Lawyer for Wearing Cross." It backfires spectacularly. Pam's phone buzzed, then again, and again. Colleagues, old law school peers, reporters. People craved details of what had just occurred. But Pam wasn't chasing headlines or media angles. She had a larger vision in mind. Her next move, elevating this beyond a single courtroom spat. She wasn't naive. She understood cases like these sent waves, whether she meant them to or not. This wasn't just about one judge and one attorney anymore. It was a test of an unestablished precedent that might soon take shape. Would other judges try something similar? Would lawyers feel compelled to leave their personal emblems at home to avoid conflict? Would this moment inspire others to stretch the limits of courtroom neutrality in ways that singled out personal beliefs? Pam wouldn't let that unfold. By that evening, the story had gained a momentum of its own. A prominent legal analyst on a conservative news channel raised it during a panel discussion. On social media, fierce arguments erupted between those backing the judge's stance and those viewing Pam's resistance as a vital defense of constitutional freedoms. Pam sat in her office, observing the debate unfold on her phone. A producer from a national news outlet had already contacted her, seeking an interview. She exhaled slowly, rubbing her temple. She'd spent years battling for clients, holding firm in high-stakes cases, but this felt distinct. This wasn't about business disagreements or criminal defenses. It was about personal liberties and whether they could be snatched away on a judge's whim. But Judge Prescott wasn't finished with her yet. She could feel it. Even as she exited the courthouse that day, the way he'd stared at her before slamming the gavel and ending the session. He might have retracted the fine, but something in his look held an unspoken dare. Pam wasn't sure how it would manifest, but she knew this fight was far from over. Pam had braced for some aftermath, a few emails, perhaps a handful of calls from colleagues offering opinions. What she hadn't predicted was the lightning speed at which it all snowballed. By the time she stepped into her office the next morning, her assistant, Lauren, was already waiting, her face tense. "You need to check this," she said, holding up her tablet. Pam took it, scanning the display. The Florida Bar Association had just released a statement, carefully phrased, neutral in tone, but its implications unmistakable. Judges hold the authority to preserve decorum in their courtrooms. While attorneys enjoy personal expression, it's critical to honor the guidelines established by presiding judges. We rely on our judicial system to handle these issues with equity and honor. Pam released a slow breath. This wasn't just a remark, it was a caution. The phrase "honor the guidelines set by presiding judges" wasn't a broad observation, it was a hint. The legal community was close-knit. The Florida Bar seldom weighed in on courtroom quarrels unless they sensed a situation spiraling out of control. This suggested Prescott wasn't merely resentful. He was already maneuvering behind closed doors to muster institutional support. She set the tablet down. "This dropped today." Lauren nodded. An hour ago. Pam wasn't shocked. The legal circle was tight. News spread quickly, and Prescott clearly wasn't brushing this off. But before she could respond, Lauren hesitated. "There's more," she said cautiously. Pam looked up, her face unreadable. "Go ahead." Lauren handed her a printed sheet. Pam skimmed the opening lines, her pulse steady, but her thoughts accelerating. Attorney Pamela Bondi acted in a way that disturbed courtroom proceedings, undermined judicial authority improperly, and displayed conduct unfitting for an officer of the court. Pam couldn't hold back. She let out a brief, dry chuckle. Unfitting. She shook her head. That's bold. Lauren sighed. It's payback, plain and simple. Pam leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping the armrest. Prescott wasn't just seeking revenge. He was aiming to make an example of her. He'd lost on his own turf, and now he was wielding the system to reclaim his dominance, filing this official grievance to flip the script. He was no longer the judge who'd overreached. He was casting himself as the one who'd been insulted. And Pam, he wanted to paint her as a brash lawyer who defied him just for defiance's sake.